He adjusted the scope and counted what he had. 11 soldiers pinned inside a converted rail depot, one functioning radio, and a fuel reserve that wouldn't last the night. He smiled, not because he'd won, but because he could already calculate exactly how long it would take them to lose. His name was Colonel Vasek Dern, and he had spent 23 years learning how terrain amplifies desperation. The Harkov Pass in winter was not a battlefield, it was a funnel. And right now, everything inside that funnel belonged to him. What Dern did not know, what none of his forward observers reported, because none of them had thought to look at the eastern ridgeline above the 2,800-meter contour, was that someone had been watching him for 6 hours. Her name was Sergeant First Class Nadia Fenn, and she had arrived at her position before dawn. Before the column had even assembled at the staging point 12 kilometers south. She hadn't been ordered there. She had read the topographic survey, done the math on likely approach vectors, and simply gone. The Army had a formal designation for what she did. In practice, almost nobody in her battalion understood it well enough to use her correctly. Her commanding officer, Major Curtis Hale, was a good man and a capable logistician who had once told her, with complete sincerity, that he wasn't sure what to do with her. She had told him that was fine. She didn't need him to understand. She just needed him to not interfere. He had, to his credit, agreed. The depot at Harkov had been a fuel transfer station during the Cold War, then a storage facility, then nothing. For the past 11 months, it had served as a forward observation post for a small joint team, 8 American soldiers and 3 Allied liaison officers, whose job was to monitor movement through the pass and relay information to a command element 40 kilometers west. They were not supposed to be in a fight. They were supposed to watch and report. But Dern's column had moved faster than the intelligence window predicted, and now 11 people were inside a building with meter-thick stone walls and approximately 4 hours of generator fuel, and the closest extraction asset was a helicopter that couldn't fly in current wind conditions. Captain Jerome Aldous was the senior officer inside the depot. He was 31 years old, had done 2 deployments in different theaters, and was by every metric his performance reviews used, an excellent officer. He stood at the narrow window on the north wall and watched the column spread across the valley floor and thought about his options with the quiet precision of someone who already knows the answer is not good. His radio operator, Specialist Devra Koss, had raised the command element twice. Both times the response was the same. Extraction window in approximately 4 hours. Hold position. Do not engage. 4 hours. Dern's forward element would be within direct fire range in 40 minutes. Aldous looked at his team. 8 soldiers, 3 liaison officers, 1 functioning vehicle with a cracked axle that would not survive mountain terrain. He did the math the same way every officer does when the math doesn't work. He did it again and got the same answer. Tell them we copy, he said to Koss. Hold position. At 2,847 meters above the valley floor, Nadia Fenn was also doing math. She was lying on a foam pad she'd cut to fit the contour of the rock shelf. Wearing a ghillie suit, she'd modified herself over 18 months of field use, breathing at a rate her instructors at the advanced sniper course had once described as physiologically unusual. Her rifle was a heavily customized platform that she'd had to write a separate equipment justification memo to bring into theater. The memo had been 3 pages long and had included 2 citations from peer-reviewed physics journals. Her spotter, Corporal Devin Trace, was positioned 6 meters to her left. He was 24 years old, very good at his job, and had been working with Fenn for 7 months. In that time, he had learned 2 things about her that he considered genuinely important. She was never wrong about distance, and she became very quiet right before she did something that seemed impossible. She was very quiet now. Column split, Trace said softly, his eye to his own optic. Lead element, 3 vehicles, bearing northwest toward the depot approach road. Second element holding at the junction. Third element, he paused. Third element is pushing east. Toward the ridgeline? I see them, Fenn said. They're going to cut off our exfil route. I know. So what are we, Trace? Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was running calculations, not cold, just very concentrated like heat through a lens. How many vehicles in the lead element? 3. 2 light armor, 1 command variant. If the command variant loses propulsion at the road bend, The switchback at grid point November 7. What happens to the two light armor vehicles behind it? Trace thought about it. The road at November 7 was cut into the mountainside, single lane, with a 40-meter drop on the western side. A stopped vehicle there didn't just stop, it created a wall. They halt, he said. They can't go around. They'd have to reverse half a kilometer to find a turnout. And the second element at the junction? They're watching the approach road. If the lead element stops moving, they'll probably assume contact and consolidate, which pulls them away from the depot's north approach. Trace was quiet for a moment. You're going to stop the command variant at November 7. I'm going to stop the command variant at November 7, Nadia. He only used her first name when he was about to say something she wasn't going to like. That's a 200-meter shot. In these conditions, with the crosswind off the eastern face, 2,240, she said, and the crosswind is variable. It's averaging 6 meters per second, but it drops to under 2 in the 3-second window after each gust cycle. I've been timing it for 4 hours. He looked at her. She was still watching the valley. Okay, he said. In the depot, Aldous was on the radio again. The wind outside had picked up. He could hear it in the gaps around the window frames, a low, steady pressure that changed pitch every few minutes as it moved across the mountain face. Koss handed him the handset. Command element, they want a sit-trip. Aldous took it. He gave the sit-trip honestly. Lead element of hostile column, approximately 30 minutes from visual range of the depot. In excess the strength of the full column, in excess of their defensive capacity. Extraction window still outside their ability to hold. The voice on the other end was calm. Command voices always are. That's what they train you to do. Keep your voice level so the people in the field don't hear your own math not working. We're working the extraction timeline, the voice said. Hold position. Copy that, Aldous said. He handed the handset back to Koss. From the north window, one of the liaison officers, a Finnish major named Saarinen, whose English was precise and whose opinions were always worth hearing, said quietly, the lead vehicles have stopped. Aldous crossed the room in 4 steps. The 3 vehicles in the column's lead element were stopped on the switchback, not slowing. Stopped. The command variant was sideways across the road. Even from this distance, through the depot's spotting scope, Aldous could see the doors coming open, figures moving around the vehicle with the particular energy of people who had not expected to stop and were not sure why they had. What happened? Koss asked. Nobody in the depot had an answer. They had heard nothing. No explosion. No impact. The wind had been loud, and then the vehicles had stopped, and now the column's second element, visible on the valley floor, was pulling toward the junction rather than advancing. Saarinen watched through the scope for a long moment, then he said, someone is controlling where they go. At 2,847 meters, Trace called the impact. Hit. Engine block, driver's side. Vehicle is stopped. Fenn was already working the next calculation. The second element moving toward the junction was expected. She had planned for it. What she was watching now was the third element, the 6 soldiers on foot who had been pushing east along the ridgeline toward her exfil route. They had stopped when the command variant stopped. They were looking at the valley, trying to understand what they were seeing, the way people do when an event is too far away and too unexpected to parse immediately. She had approximately 4 minutes before they started moving again. Third element is stationary, Trace said. But they'll resume. They'll resume toward the ridgeline, Fenn said, which means they'll pass through the draw at Oscar 3. That draw is exposed. If they're in the draw and moving east, we can't exfil north. We're not exfilling north. Trace turned his head slightly. We plan to exfil north. I know. The plan changed when I counted their third element this morning and realized they had enough personnel to cover both ridgeline approach routes simultaneously. She paused. The crosswind dropped for 2 seconds, and she exhaled slowly. We're going south, down to the tree line, then west along the 2,400-meter contour to the secondary extraction point. That's 4 kilometers in winter gear on a 40-degree slope. 3.7, and it's 38 degrees at that contour. I checked the survey. Trace made a sound that was not quite a laugh. After 7 months, he'd stopped arguing with her terrain math. When do we move? After the next shot. I need the third element looking the wrong direction when we go. Inside the depot, the fourth hour was becoming the third hour. Koss had been tracking the time because someone had to, and because it gave her hands something to do. Aldous was at the north window. Saarinen was at the east window. The rest of the team was distributed at firing positions they all understood. They would probably not need to use, because it would mean whatever was happening outside had stopped happening. Whatever was happening outside had been happening for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The lead element was still stopped at November 7. A recovery vehicle had been dispatched from the main body and had gotten halfway up the switchback road before something happened to its front axle. The recovery vehicle was now also stopped, jackknifed across the lower section of the approach road, which meant the approach road was effectively blocked in both directions. The second element had consolidated at the junction, which put them in a position to support either the main body or the lead element, but effectively committed them to neither. They were holding because the column's command structure was, Aldous could only guess, trying to figure out what was happening. The third element on the ridgeline had stopped moving east and reversed back toward the valley floor. Nobody in the depot knew why. Saarinen had a theory, which he offered at the window with the measured tone of someone who had learned not to say things definitively when the evidence was still arriving. Something frightened them on the ridgeline, he said. They reversed too fast for it to be a command order. That's a reactive movement. Frightened them how? Aldous asked. I don't know. But that, Saarinen gestured toward the still blocked road, and this, he gestured toward the retreated third element, are not coincidental. Aldous looked at the valley. 2 hours and 40 minutes. Every time Dern's column had tried to move, something had stopped it. Not explosions, not airstrikes, not any action that Aldous' team had taken. Just stops. Malfunctions. Vehicles that ceased to function at precisely the moment and location where a stopped vehicle created the most disruption to the column's movement. He turned to Koss. Get me command element. When the handset crackled, he didn't give a sidetrip. He asked a question. Do we have any assets operating in the Harkov sector, specifically above the 2,800-meter line on the eastern ridge line? The pause was longer than pauses usually are. Then, not officially, Captain. Aldous understood what that meant. He'd heard that phrasing before, in a different theater, in a context that he'd been told not to put in writing. He set the handset down and looked at Saarinen. Someone's up there, Saarinen said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, Aldous said. Fenn fired twice more before she moved. The first shot was at a vehicle that had been attempting to circle south around the blocked road, using what her topographic map indicated was a seasonal track not on most navigation systems. She had identified the track 6 hours earlier during her initial survey. She had wondered whether they would find it. They had. She put a round through the vehicle's front differential at 1,890 meters. The vehicle stopped. The track was narrow enough that the vehicle stopping effectively closed it. The second shot was different. It wasn't at a vehicle or a piece of equipment. It was at a point on the rock face of the ridgeline's lower slope, a point that was, she had calculated, precisely within line of sight of Dern's observation position at the valley's southern edge. She wasn't trying to hit anything. She was trying to make a sound and a mark at a specific location. The shot hit exactly where she intended, and the rock scar was visible from 800 meters. Trace, watching through his optics, said, That's not going to make sense to them. It's not supposed to make sense to them, Fenn said. She was already starting to break down her position. It's supposed to make them look at the wrong ridgeline, the west ridgeline, for approximately 40 minutes. Long enough for us to clear the draw. They moved south. The slope was cold and steep, and the snow was the kind that had frozen into a crust that broke unexpectedly underfoot, which meant each step required attention. Fenn moved with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had learned that speed and haste are not the same thing. Trace stayed 2 meters behind her, matching her pace, watching their 6 o'clock. They were 200 meters below the firing position when she stopped and held up one fist. Trace stopped. She pointed east. He looked, a single figure on the ridgeline, high, picking his way across the rock face, with the careful movement of someone under orders to search, rather than someone who knew what he was looking for. She watched the figure for 30 seconds. The figure did not look south. The figure was looking west, toward the false scar on the rock face. She lowered her hand and kept moving. The extraction helicopter arrived at the secondary point 40 minutes inside the revised window. The pilot, warrant officer named Crane, touched down in a small clearing at the 2,400-meter contour on the western slope and was surprised to find two soldiers waiting for him. One of whom, the smaller one, was carrying a rifle case that he recognized immediately as something that should not be in a theater at that altitude without significantly more paperwork than he had ever seen. "You the Harkov asset?" Crane asked. "We're the asset," the smaller soldier said. He looked at the rifle case, then at the valley below, where he could see from altitude that a column of vehicles was stationary in several different locations that made no obvious sense. The approach road was blocked. A seasonal track to the south was blocked. A ridgeline approach was blocked. It looked, from the air, like someone had folded the terrain into a series of obstacles that happened to be exactly where obstacles were needed. "Long flight from the depot," Crane said. He was trying to figure out how far the secondary extraction point was from the main observation post. "We weren't at the depot," Fenn said. She loaded into the helicopter with the economy of motion of someone who had been cold for 12 hours and was ready to stop. Crane took off. Below them, the column was beginning the slow process of reorganizing, vehicles reversing, new routes being assessed, a command structure working through the confusion of an afternoon that had not gone the way it was planned. It would take them hours. By the time they found a clear route to the depot, the extraction window would have long since closed, and the team inside would be gone. Crane looked at his instruments, then at the soldier in the seat behind him. "What were you doing up there?" he said. She was writing something in a small notebook. She didn't look up. "Controlling outcomes," she said. 2 days later, in a briefing room at the Command Element's forward operating base, Major Curtis Hale sat across from Captain Jerome Aldous and learned in stages what had happened at Harkov Pass. Aldous told it the way soldiers tell things that they did not personally witness, factually, with appropriate uncertainty, marking the points where his own observation ended and inference began. He described the stopped vehicles, the blocked road, the reversed third element, the 2 hours and 40 minutes during which an entire armed column had been managed. That was the word he used, managed, from a position that nobody in the column had been able to identify. Hale listened without interrupting. When Aldous finished, Hale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're describing a single shooter." "I'm describing what I observed," Aldous said, "and what I can infer from it. Whether it was one shooter or 10, I can't say for certain." "It was one," Hale said. Aldous looked at him. "She filed a post-operation report at SO 600 this morning," Hale said. "Standard format, 4 pages. She listed 7 engagements, 6 vehicles disabled, 1 terrain feature struck, all at ranges between 1,500 and 2,240 meters. He paused. "She also filed a route deviation report because she deviated from the planned exfiltration route without prior authorization." "She filed a route deviation report," Aldous said slowly. "She followed procedure," Hale said. There was something in his voice that was not quite any single emotion. "That's what she does. She follows procedure where procedure applies, and everywhere else she does what the math says needs to be done." Aldous looked at the map on the table between them. The Harkov sector, the pass, the rail depot where 11 people had waited for 4 hours while something happened on the ridgeline above them that none of them understood until later. "Where is she now?" he asked. "She's in the equipment room," Hale said, "writing another memo. Apparently the cold affected one of her scope adjustments and she wants it on record before the maintenance window." Aldous looked at the map for another moment. Then he looked up. "What's her name?" he asked. "Fenn," Hale said. "Sergeant First Class Nadia Fenn." Aldous nodded slowly. "Someone should tell her," he said, "what happened inside the depot, what those 4 hours looked like from where we were sitting." Hale was quiet for a moment. "I mentioned it in my acknowledgement of her report," he said. "I told her that her actions contributed to the successful hold of the Harkov position." "What did she say?" Hale looked at the map. "She said the hold was Captain Aldis's. She just worked the terrain. The notebook she kept was small and brown and had no markings on the outside. It held calculations, range estimates, wind readings, time logs, notes on how different temperatures affected her particular ammunition at altitude. There were also other things in it, written in the margins in a smaller hand, observations, mostly, things she noticed that didn't fit in a standard report. On the page dated the Harkov operation, after the final calculations, she had written one line. They were counting vehicles. They should have been counting ridgelines. She closed the notebook and set it on the small folding table beside her cot. Outside, the wind over the fob was steady and from the northwest, which meant nothing today. No mountains between here and the next 3 kilometers of flat terrain, no range calculation required. She'd spent 6 hours on a frozen rock shelf, watching a column that didn't know she existed make exactly the decisions she'd predicted they would make. And in the morning, she would write a memo about a scope adjustment, and someone would read it, and the equipment would be serviced, and the next time a pass needed watching, she would go and read the terrain before dawn and wait to see whether anyone had learned yet to look up. They usually hadn't. She was fine with that.